Harper Caldwell noticed him the moment he stepped into business class. Wrong jacket, wrong shoes, wrong life. The man wore a canvas work coat stained with engine grease, the kind mechanics never quite wash out. His son clung to his chest, face flushed with fever, small fists tangled in fabric that had seen too many long shifts. She didn't hide her disdain. "Upgrade buyers," she murmured to her assistant, loud enough. "They scrape together miles just to sit where they don't belong." Her assistant snickered. Other passengers glanced over. The man never looked up. He just held his boy closer and whispered something that made the child's sobbing fade to quiet hiccups. Harper returned to her magazine, a spread on tech CEOs who built empires from nothing, self-made, deserving. The plane leveled at cruising altitude. Then the intercom crackled. "This is your senior flight attendant. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit." A pause. Too long. "Are there any fighter pilots on board?" Harper's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. The mechanic stood. She actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that made heads turn, until he walked past her toward the cockpit door. His eyes didn't waver. They held something she'd only seen once before in her father's face during the flight that almost killed him, the kind of steady that comes from staring down death at 40,000 feet and refusing to blink. The gate agent at Boston Logan had called Garrett Stone's name 3 times before he heard it over Lucas's crying. His son pressed hot cheeks against his neck, tiny body shaking with each cough that rattled through his 4-year-old chest. Garrett shifted the boy's weight, feeling the fever radiate through both their shirts, and approached the podium with the kind of exhausted shuffle that came from 16-hour shifts at the hangar. The agent's smile tightened when she saw the grease still embedded under his fingernails, despite 20 minutes of scrubbing in the airport bathroom. She slid 2 boarding passes across the counter with barely concealed reluctance, as if the laminated cards might carry the smell of hydraulic fluid and desperation. Business class was a fluke. Garrett's supervisor had insisted, pressed the upgraded tickets into his calloused palm, with eyes that understood what it meant to raise a child alone. "Take the kid somewhere warm," he'd said. "Get out of this freezing city for a week." So here Garrett sat, surrounded by leather and polished glass, trying to make Lucas comfortable in a world that clearly didn't want them there. The boy's breathing had finally evened out, small chest rising and falling against Garrett's arm. He could feel the stares from nearby passengers, the wrinkled nose from the woman in pearls, the sidelong glance from the businessman with the titanium watch. Garrett had learned years ago not to let it touch him. Let them look. Let them judge. None of it mattered as long as Lucas was safe. Harper Caldwell settled into her window seat with practiced efficiency, arranging her tablet and noise-canceling headphones with movements honed by 1,000 business trips. She'd built Caldwell Technologies from a Stanford dorm room to a $4 billion empire in less than 15 years. Forbes called her the youngest self-made female tech billionaire in America. The Wall Street Journal ran features on her management philosophy. Harvard Business School used her company as a case study. She'd earned every accolade through 90-hour weeks and decisions that required the kind of ruthlessness most people couldn't stomach. So when her assistant Stephanie leaned over and whispered about the situation 2 rows back, Harper allowed herself one quick glance and one cutting remark. It was all the attention such people deserved. The flight attendant offered champagne. Harper accepted, letting the cold glass settle between her fingers as the plane pushed back from the gate. Outside her window, ground crew scattered like ants as the aircraft began its crawl toward the runway. She loved this moment, the controlled power of departure, the ascent into rarefied air where only those who'd climbed high enough could breathe. Her phone buzzed with a text from her chief operating officer about the Tokyo expansion. She typed back a response with her free hand, barely noticing when the engines roared to life. Takeoff pressed her back into the seat, that familiar rush of acceleration that always felt like vindication. Up here, the rules were different. Up here, she was untouchable. Lucas whimpered in his sleep, and Garrett felt the heat coming off his son's skin in waves that made his stomach clench. The airport clinic had said it was just a virus, nothing serious. But every parent knew that hollow reassurance meant nothing when your child burned like a furnace in your arms. He dampened a napkin with water from his bottle and pressed it gently to Lucas's forehead. Watching the small face relax slightly at the cool touch, the boy had his mother's features, the same delicate nose, the same sweep of dark lashes. Garrett kept his own breathing steady even as his chest tightened. 6 years. It had been 6 years since Rebecca died, and some days the absence still hit like shrapnel. The flight leveled out at cruising altitude, cabin lights dimmed to a comfortable glow. Garrett leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting the white noise of pressurized air fill the space where thoughts tried to intrude. He'd stopped trying to sleep on planes years ago. His body remembered too much. The violent pitch of a damaged aircraft, the screaming alarms, the impossible geometry of a spinning horizon when every system failed at once. Commercial flying was supposed to be safe. Statistics said it was the safest form of travel. But statistics had never sat in a cockpit with one engine gone and another on fire, calculating whether you had enough altitude to glide to a runway or if you'd be swimming home. Harper finished her second glass of champagne and opened her laptop. The quarterly report needed review before tomorrow's board meeting in Miami. She scrolled through projected revenue figures, market penetration analyses, competitor assessments. Numbers had always made sense to her in ways people never did. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't pretend. They simply existed in clean columns of truth that rewarded those smart enough to read them correctly. Her company's stock had risen 18% in the last quarter. 18%. She'd done that through strategic acquisitions and calculated risks that made her investors nervous until the results proved her right. Again. She was always right. Stephanie dozed in the seat beside her, head tilted at an angle that would guarantee a stiff neck later. Harper glanced at her assistant with something that might have been fondness if she'd allowed herself such weaknesses. Stephanie had been with her for 7 years, surviving the brutal pace and demanding standards that churned through support staff like a meat grinder. The girl had value. She understood when to speak and when silence was the wiser choice. She never questioned Harper's decisions, never suggested that perhaps there were considerations beyond profit margins and market dominance. That kind of loyalty was rare. Harper paid well for it. The businessman across the aisle ordered scotch. The woman in pearls worked on her needlepoint. Somewhere behind them, a baby fussed briefly before settling. The plane carved through darkness at 570 miles per hour. A metal tube suspended between Earth and stars, held aloft by physics and faith. Garrett opened his eyes and looked down at Lucas, watching his son's chest rise and fall in the shallow rhythm of fevered sleep. He'd memorized every detail of that small face, the tiny scar above the left eyebrow from a fall at daycare, the constellation of freckles across both cheeks, the way his mouth went soft and loose when sleep finally claimed him. This child was everything. The only thing. The rest of the world could burn as long as Lucas was safe. Harper's screen flickered. She frowned and tapped the trackpad. The display stabilized. Outside her window, stars scattered across black infinity like diamonds on velvet. She'd flown this route 100 times, Boston to Miami, barely 2 hours in the air. The pilot usually announced landmarks, passing over New York, skirting the edge of Philadelphia, the gradual descent toward Florida's coast. She checked her watch. They were only 40 minutes into the flight. Still over the Atlantic, probably. The water beneath them would be dark and cold and utterly indifferent to the fragile machines that dared cross it. The intercom clicked on. Harper barely registered it, expecting the usual update about cruising altitude or estimated arrival time. Instead, the senior flight attendant's voice came through with an edge that made something in Harper's chest tighten before her brain caught up. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical situation in the cockpit. Please remain calm and stay seated." A pause stretched too long. Harper's fingers stopped moving on her keyboard. Around her, passengers shifted, uncertain murmurs rippling through the cabin. The flight attendant's voice returned, steady but tight. "We need to know immediately. Are there any fighter pilots on board?" The cabin erupted in confused whispers. Harper's champagne glass was suddenly heavy in her hand, condensation making her palms slick. Fighter pilots. Not just pilots. Fighter pilots. Her mind raced through implications, each one worse than the last. Commercial pilots were trained for this. They had redundancy, co-pilots, protocols. Unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Unless both pilots were incapacitated. Unless 237 people were in a metal tube with no one trained to land it. She turned her head toward the front of the cabin, just as movement caught her peripheral vision. Garrett Stone was standing. The mechanic. The man with the grease-stained jacket and the crying child. He stood in the aisle with his son still pressed against his shoulder, and for one insane moment, Harper thought he might be trying to use the bathroom. Then he shifted Lucas carefully into the arms of an older woman across the aisle, a grandmother type who took the feverish boy without question, and began moving toward the front of the plane. Harper's laugh burst out before she could stop it. Sharp, disbelieving. Heads turned. The man walked past her row, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. No fear. No hesitation. Just a terrible, steady calm that belonged to people who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. A flight attendant intercepted him near the galley. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." Garrett's voice was quiet, but it carried. "I'm a fighter pilot. 8 years with the 104th Fighter Squadron. M16 primarily, sometime on 15s. The attendant's face went white. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the cockpit door. Harper stared at her laptop screen without seeing it. The businessman's Scotch glass trembled against the armrest. Stephanie had woken up, eyes wide and confused. Around them, the cabin had gone silent except for the endless drone of engines that suddenly sounded far too loud. The cockpit door opened. Garrett stepped through. It closed behind him with a sound like a vault ceiling. Harper realized she was holding her breath. She forced herself to exhale, to think rationally. This was impossible. The mechanic couldn't be a fighter pilot. Fighter pilots didn't end up fixing engines in civilian hangars, wearing clothes stained with grease, flying coach, business class, whatever. It didn't matter. They didn't raise children alone and look like they'd been beaten down by life until there was nothing left but exhaustion and quiet endurance. Fighter pilots were officers, elite. They had careers, futures, the kind of swagger that came from being the best. They didn't look like Garrett Stone. Inside the cockpit, Garrett's eyes scanned the instrument panel in less than 3 seconds. Captain unconscious, slumped over the yoke. First officer hyperventilating in the right seat. Hands shaking so badly he couldn't grip the controls. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Backup systems engaged, but failing. Altitude holding at 37,000 feet, but the plane was in a slight, uncommanded right bank. Garrett's hands moved before his conscious mind finished processing. He pulled the captain back, checked for a pulse, weak but present, probable stroke or heart attack, and dragged him out of the seat with strength that came from years of hauling ordnance and wounded pilots. The first officer looked at him with eyes that had already given up. I've only got 200 hours. I can't do this." Garrett slid into the captain's seat. "I can. Get on the radio and tell air traffic control we're declaring an emergency. Tell them we have an incapacitated captain and a military pilot at the controls. I need vectors to the nearest suitable runway. His hands found the yoke, and muscle memory from 10,000 flight hours took over. The plane responded immediately, leveling out as he corrected the bank. "What's your name?" The first officer gulped air. Christopher Banks." Garrett's voice stayed level. "Chris, I need you to focus. I need you to be my co-pilot for the next 30 minutes. Can you do that?" The younger man nodded, hands still shaking but reaching for the radio. "Good. Now make the call." Harper heard the change before she understood it. The engine note shifted. The slight tilt she'd barely noticed corrected itself. She looked out the window and saw the wing level against the stars. Around her, passengers whispered prayers or clutched armrests or stared at phones that had no service over open ocean. Stephanie gripped Harper's arm. "What's happening?" Harper had no answer. She'd built an empire on certainty, on knowing more than everyone else in the room, on seeing 3 moves ahead. But right now, she was as helpless as every other soul in this cabin. Their lives rested in the hands of a man she'd mocked, a man whose name she didn't even know. The radio crackled in Garrett's headset. "November 742. Charlie Papa, Boston Center copies your emergency. We're showing you 100 nautical miles southeast of Atlantic City. Recommend divert to Atlantic City International. Runway, 13 available, winds light and variable. Emergency equipment standing by." Garrett's fingers moved across switches and dials with the precision of someone who'd done this in the dark, in storms, with half the instruments shot out. "Boston Center. 2 Charlie Papa. I'm former military, F-16 qualified. Current on type ratings for 737s through simulator work. Request vectors for straight-in approach, minimum communication. I need to focus on flying." The controller's voice came back with barely controlled relief. 2 Charlie Papa, roger. Turn left, heading 270. Descend and maintain flight level 250. You're cleared direct Atlantic City when able. Garrett repeated the instructions and began the descent. The plane responded smoothly, engines throttling back, nose dipping toward the invisible horizon. Beside him, Chris had stopped hyperventilating and was reading off checklist items with growing confidence. "Hydraulic pressure?" Garrett glanced at the gauge. "Down to 20% on System A. B and C are holding. We'll have brakes and steering. Flaps might be limited." The younger pilot's voice steadied. "If flaps don't deploy," Garrett cut him off, "then we land faster. I've put down a Viper with no hydraulics and 1 elevator. This is a walk in the park." Lucas woke to find himself in a stranger's arms. The older woman smiled at him with the kind of gentleness that came from raising children of her own. "It's okay, sweetheart. Your daddy's helping fly the plane. He'll be back soon." The boy's fever had broken slightly, leaving him weak and confused. He looked around the cabin with wide eyes, seeing faces tense with fear, hearing whispers about crashes and prayers and goodbye texts to loved ones. "Daddy?" His voice was small. The woman held him closer. "Your daddy is very brave. He's making sure we all get home safe." Lucas pressed his face into her shoulder, too tired to cry. Too young to understand that bravery sometimes meant walking toward the thing that terrified you most. Harper's laptop had gone dark. She stared at her reflection in the blank screen. 39 years old. $4 billion. 312 employees. Forbes covers and keynote speeches, and a legacy built on being smarter, faster, more ruthless than anyone else. And right now, none of it meant anything. She couldn't buy her way out of this. She couldn't negotiate or strategize or intimidate physics into submission. She was as powerless as the child crying 2 rows back, as powerless as the mechanic she dismissed with a glance and a cutting word. The mechanic who was currently the only thing between her and the cold Atlantic. The plane continued its descent. Garrett's hands never stopped moving, making tiny corrections, adjusting trim, monitoring instruments, with the kind of attention that looked effortless, but required every neuron firing in perfect synchronization. He'd learned to fly this way in combat. Smooth, economic, no wasted motion. His instructors had called it natural talent, but Garrett knew better. It was survival instinct refined through repetition until the plane became an extension of his body. He felt the aircraft through his hands and feet and the seat of his pants. He knew when thrust was too high by the vibration in his spine. He sensed turbulence before the instruments showed it. Flying wasn't something he did. It was what he was. Boston Center handed them off to Atlantic City Approach. The new controller's voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone managing a crisis. 2 Charlie Papa, Atlantic City Approach. You're 10 miles from the outer marker. Descend to 2,000 feet. Report runway in sight. Garrett acknowledged and continued the descent. Through the windscreen, lights appeared in the distance. The bright cluster of a city. The darker stretch of runway illuminated like a landing strip for angels. Chris pulled up the approach plate on his screen. They've cleared everything else out of the airspace. We've got the whole sky. Garrett nodded once. Good. Tell the cabin to prepare for landing. Brace position. This might be rough. The senior flight attendant's voice came over the intercom with remarkable composure. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened tightly. Place your heads down and brace against the seat in front of you. Remain in the brace position until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Harper heard the instructions as if from a great distance. She leaned forward, crossed her arms on the seat back ahead of her, tucked her head down. Around her, 200 people did the same. The cabin filled with whispered prayers and silent tears, and the terrible sound of collective breath held too long. Garrett called for the landing checklist. Chris read off items with a voice that only shook slightly. Landing gear. Garrett reached for the lever, felt the thunk as the wheels dropped and locked. 3 green lights. Down and locked. The approach continued. 2 miles. The runway lights grew from pinpoints to a brilliant corridor of white and red. Garrett's world narrowed to airspeed, altitude, descent rate, runway alignment. Nothing else existed. Not the 200 souls behind him, not the wife who died in his arms, not the fevered child who needed him to come back. Just the mathematics of controlled flight and the shrinking distance to solid ground. 1 mile. He could see the runway numbers now, 13. He cross-checked the localizer. Perfect alignment. Airspeed 140 knots, a little fast but acceptable given the possible flap limitation. Rate of descent 700 feet per minute. The runway rose to meet them, half mile. Garrett called for flaps. Chris moved the lever. The indicator showed only 15 degrees when it should have been 30. That's all we've got. Garrett's voice never changed. We'll take it. He adjusted his mental calculations. Landing speed would be higher. He'd need more runway. Atlantic City's runway was 10,000 feet. Plenty of room even with minimal flaps and hot brakes. The threshold lights passed beneath them. Garrett pulled back slightly on the yoke, feeling for the flare. The plane hung for one perfect moment between sky and earth. Then the main wheels kissed the pavement with a squeal of rubber. He deployed thrust reversers, felt the massive engines roar in opposition to forward motion. The nose wheel came down. Brakes engaged. Full pressure, fighting the aircraft's momentum with controlled fury. The runway lights blurred past. 7,000 feet. 6,000. 5,000. The plane slowed, slowed, slowed. 4,000 feet remaining when they finally rolled to a stop. Garrett's hands moved through the shutdown procedure. Engines spooled down. Hydraulic systems depressurized. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Lights strobing red and blue against the night. Chris's hands were shaking again, but this time with relief. We're down. Oh God, we're actually down. Garrett unbuckled and moved to check the captain, who was groaning back to consciousness. Paramedics were already boarding through the forward door. He stepped aside to let them work, then turned to face the cabin. 237 faces stared back at him, some crying, some laughing, most just stunned into silence. Garrett's eyes found the older woman holding Lucas. His son was awake now, reaching for him with small arms. He walked down the aisle, aware of every gaze following him, and took Lucas back with hands that had finally started to tremble. Harper raised her head slowly. Her neck hurt. Her fingers ached from gripping the armrest. She was alive. They were all alive. The mechanic walked past her row, and she saw him clearly now in the harsh emergency lighting. The grease stains on his jacket, the exhaustion carved into lines around his eyes. The way he held his son like the child was the only thing in the world that mattered. Their eyes met for half a second. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. She looked away first, heat flooding her face with something she hadn't felt in years. Shame. The evacuation was orderly, despite the fear still crackling through the cabin. Slides deployed. Passengers filed out into the cool night air of a New Jersey runway. Garrett stood at the bottom of the slide, holding Lucas, watching people stream past. Some thanked him, others were too shocked to speak. A few stopped to touch his arm or shoulder, as if physical contact could confirm he was real. Harper Caldwell was one of the last to exit. She descended the slide with as much dignity as possible and found herself standing 3 feet from the man who'd saved her life. Stephanie hovered nearby, still white-faced and trembling. Harper opened her mouth, closed it. Every word that came to mind sounded inadequate or false, or both. She stopped, started again. Thank you. The words felt hollow. Insufficient payment for a debt that could never be repaid. Garrett looked at her with those same steady eyes that had somehow landed a crippled aircraft in the dark. Just doing what needed to be done. His voice was quiet, unremarkable. The voice of a man who'd spoken the same words 100 times before when people tried to call him a hero. Lucas coughed against his father's neck. Garrett's attention shifted immediately back to his son. We need to get him to a doctor. He turned away without waiting for a response. Harper watched him walk toward the waiting ambulances, watched paramedics intercept him and check Lucas over, watched the man fade into the controlled chaos of an emergency scene. Stephanie appeared at her elbow. Ms. Caldwell, the airline is arranging ground transportation to Miami. They said we can catch a flight first thing in the morning. Harper didn't respond. She was still staring at the spot where Garrett Stone had disappeared into the night. Behind her, the aircraft sat silent on the runway, emergency lights painting its fuselage in shades of red that looked like warning or shame. The wind off the Atlantic carried the smell of jet fuel and salt. She shivered despite her coat. The hotel the airline provided was clean, but generic. Harper stood in the shower until the water ran cold, scrubbing at skin that felt contaminated by her own arrogance. She'd laughed at him, actually laughed when he stood up, as if the universe had played a joke and he was the punchline. She'd judged him based on his clothes and his circumstances, and her own unshakable belief that she could read people at a glance. She'd been wrong, catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong. And 237 people had survived because the man she dismissed as beneath her notice was, in fact, the only person on that plane qualified to save them. She couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m, Harper sat at the small desk in her hotel room and opened her laptop. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, typing search terms she'd never imagined needing. Garrett Stone pilot, 104th Fighter Squadron, F-16. The results came back in fragments, newspaper articles from a decade ago, military commendations. A grainy photo of a younger man in uniform accepting a medal. Distinguished Flying Cross. 200 combat missions over hostile territory. He'd saved a wingman by flying his damaged aircraft into the kill zone to provide cover during ejection. He'd landed a Viper with the canopy shattered, and one eye full of blood from a bird strike at 600 knots. There was more. Harper read it all, each article adding another layer to the man she'd reduced to a sneer and a cutting comment. Major Garrett Stone had been on track for squadron commander. His service record was exemplary. His evaluations consistently rated him in the top 1% of pilots. Then, 7 years ago, the article stopped. His name disappeared from the military publications and the air show rosters and the promotion lists. Harper found the reason buried in an obituary section of a small-town newspaper. Rebecca Ann Stone, 28, beloved wife and mother, lost her battle with cancer. Survived by her husband Garrett and son Lucas, age 2. The timeline crystallized in Harper's mind. He'd resigned his commission, walked away from a career that most pilots would kill for, walked away from the prestige and the trajectory toward general stars because his wife was dying and his son needed a parent who could be present. He'd traded the cockpit of an F-16 for a mechanic's bay in a civilian hangar, traded flight suits for grease-stained canvas, traded the respect of being called Major for the dismissive glances of people like her who saw only the surface, and he'd done it without hesitation, without regret, because some things mattered more than glory. Harper closed her laptop. The darkness outside her window was absolute, no stars visible through the cloud cover that had rolled in. She thought about her own father, the corporate attorney who'd worked 80-hour weeks and missed every school play, every softball game, every moment that couldn't be billed to a client. She'd built her empire using him as a template, believing that success required sacrifice, that the people who made it to the top did so by refusing to be distracted by sentiment or softness. Garrett Stone had made the opposite choice, and he'd still been the most capable person on that aircraft. Still been the one who'd saved them all. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Morning came with brutal brightness. Harper dressed in yesterday's clothes, still wrinkled from the evacuation. Downstairs, the hotel restaurant was full of passengers from the flight, people who'd shared the same brush with death, and now eyed each other with the wary familiarity of soldiers who'd survived the same battle. She ordered coffee she didn't drink, and toast she couldn't eat. Stephanie found her there, equally hollow-eyed. The airline confirmed our Miami flight. 10 a.m. departure. Harper nodded without hearing. Her phone buzzed with messages from her office, from board members, from reporters who'd somehow already gotten wind of the story. She ignored them all. The gate area at Newark Airport was quiet. Harper sat apart from the other rebooked passengers, staring at nothing. She should have been reviewing the quarterly report, should have been preparing for the board meeting she'd already missed. Instead, she found herself searching for grease-stained jackets in every crowd, looking for a small boy with feverish cheeks, hoping for a chance to say, "What?" What could she possibly say that would matter? The mechanic had made his choice. He'd saved her life and then walked away without asking for anything in return, without even telling her his name. She'd had to find that herself, buried in search results and military records. The Miami flight boarded without incident. Harper settled into first class and opened her laptop by rote, but the numbers refused to make sense. She kept seeing Garrett's hands on the yoke, steady and sure, making corrections so small they were almost invisible, but so crucial they meant the difference between landing and catastrophe. She kept hearing his voice over the intercom, calm, factual, already moving past the fear to focus on solutions. That kind of competence didn't appear from nowhere. It was built through years of training and repetition and facing down situations where failure meant death. And he'd walked away from it all for a sick child and a dead wife's memory. The board meeting, when Harper finally made it 2 days later, was perfunctory. The quarterly numbers were strong. The Tokyo expansion was on track. Her executives delivered their reports with the crisp efficiency she demanded. But halfway through the CFO's presentation on market projections, Harper held up one hand. The room fell silent. "Before we continue," she said slowly, "I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about how we value people." Confused glances circulated the table. Her CFO frowned. "Ma'am?" Harper leaned back in her chair, seeing faces that had learned to read her moods like weather patterns. "How do we determine someone's worth? What metrics do we use?" The question hung in the air. Finally, her head of HR ventured an answer. "Education, experience, track record of success." Harper cut her off. "And if someone doesn't fit those markers? If they're wearing the wrong clothes, working the wrong job, living the wrong kind of life by our standards? What then?" The silence was uncomfortable now. Her executives exchanged glances, trying to determine where this was heading. Harper stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Miami. "I almost died 3 nights ago on a plane that lost its pilots. The man who saved us, who saved me, was someone I'd dismissed without a second thought. I judged him on appearances, on circumstances, on my own arrogant assumption that I could read a person's value at a glance." She turned to face them. "Major Garrett Stone flew 200 combat missions. He has a distinguished flying cross and a record of service that most of us couldn't comprehend. And I mocked him because he was wearing a jacket stained with engine grease and holding a sick child. I laughed at him when he stood up to help. Because in my world, in our world, people like that don't exist. People who sacrifice everything for someone else, who walk away from glory to be present for what matters, who possess extraordinary skill but choose ordinary lives. We don't have a column for them in our spreadsheets." The room was dead silent. "I want that to change." The search took 3 weeks. Harper used every resource at her disposal, hired private investigators, called in favors with military contacts, worked backward through employment records and FAA certifications until she found him. Garrett Stone was exactly where she'd expected, working the late shift at a regional airport maintenance hangar outside Boston, the kind of place that serviced commuter planes and charter flights and stayed invisible to people who flew commercial. Harper showed up at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, walking into the hangar past the surprised looks of mechanics who recognized her from magazine covers. She found Garrett underneath the wing of a Cessna, hydraulic fluid staining his hands, looking exactly like what he was, a skilled mechanic doing necessary work. He saw her and didn't stop what he was doing. "Miss Caldwell." His voice was neutral. Harper realized he'd known her name all along, had probably recognized her on the flight, but hadn't cared enough to mention it. The thought was oddly humbling. She waited while he finished torquing a bolt, tested the connection, wiped his hands on a rag that might have been red once, but was now the brown of old stains. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "What I said on the runway wasn't enough." Garrett's eyes met hers, and she saw the same measuring quality that had unsettled her in the airport. "You thanked me. That was enough." Harper had prepared a speech. She'd written it and rewritten it, trying to find words that conveyed gratitude and apology and recognition all at once. Standing in the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, watching this man wipe grease from his knuckles, every prepared phrase fled her mind. "I'm sorry," she said instead, "for what I said on the plane, for judging you, for being the kind of person who thinks she can assess someone's value based on their clothes and circumstances." Garrett nodded once. Apology accepted. He turned back to the Cessna. Harper didn't move. "I looked you up, read about your service. You are extraordinary." He set down his tools with care as if arranging his thoughts in the same methodical way. I was a pilot. I did my job. Now I do a different job. Harper pushed forward. You could do so much more. I run a company that... Garrett cut her off with a slight headshake. I know what you run. I know what you'd offer. Director of something. 6 figures. Corner office. The chance to feel important again. His voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. I appreciate it. But no. Harper blinked. People didn't say no to her. You don't understand. I'm trying to... He interrupted again, gently. You're trying to make yourself feel better about what happened. I understand. But I don't need saving, Miss Caldwell. I made my choices. Lucas appeared from the hangar office, walking carefully with a juice box and a coloring book. His fever had broken. He looked healthier, though still thin in the way children get when illness has taken its toll. He saw Harper and stopped, recognition flickering across his small face. Plain lady. Garrett's expression softened immediately when he looked at his son. Yeah, buddy. The plain lady came to visit. Lucas considered this. Did you say thank you to Daddy? He's the best pilot in the whole world. Harper felt something crack in her chest. Yes, I'm trying to. She crouched down to Lucas's level. Your daddy is a hero. He saved a lot of people. The boy nodded seriously. He saves people all the time. That's what daddies do. He returned to his coloring book, already losing interest in adult conversations. Harper stood slowly, her knees protesting after too many years of sitting in executive chairs. Garrett was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He doesn't know, Garrett said quietly, about the military service, about any of it. He just knows I fix planes, and I come home every night. Harper looked at the cramped office where a 4-year-old did homework while his father worked overtime. Why? Garrett picked up his tools again, returning to the Cessna's hydraulic system. Because it doesn't matter. That person I was, the major, the combat pilot. He's gone. He had to be, so I could be the person Lucas needs. He made an adjustment, tested the pressure. I don't regret it. Not for a second. Harper stood in that hangar, surrounded by the detritus of ordinary work. Parts, catalogs, and safety posters, and time cards on a cork board, and understood that she was looking at something she'd spent her entire life avoiding. Not failure, not weakness, but the conscious choice to let go of ambition for something that couldn't be quantified, or measured, or put in an annual report. She left her business card anyway, in case you ever change your mind. Or if Lucas needs anything, medical bills, college fund, anything. Garrett took it with grease-stained fingers, glanced at it once, and set it on his toolbox. Appreciate it. Harper knew he'd throw it away the moment she left. She walked back through the hangar, past mechanics who watched her with curious eyes, and climbed into the car her assistant had rented. The drive back to the airport was silent. Stephanie, who'd witnessed the entire exchange from a respectful distance, finally spoke. He said no? Harper nodded. He said no. The story leaked anyway. Someone from the flight sold it to a news outlet, and within days, Garrett Stone's face was on morning shows and news sites. The narrative was irresistible. Humble mechanic saves hundreds, walks away from fame. Reporters camped outside his apartment. His supervisor had to hire security for the hangar. Lucas's daycare called to report photographers trying to get pictures. Through it all, Garrett said nothing, gave no interviews, made no statements. He showed up for his shifts, did his work, picked up his son on time. After 2 weeks, the media found a fresher story and moved on. The world forgot about the mechanic who'd landed a crippled airliner and then vanished back into ordinary life. Harper didn't forget. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, during board meetings when executives postured for her approval, at industry conferences where success was measured in valuations and market share, late at night in her empty penthouse, when the city lights spread below her like the instrument panel of some vast aircraft she no longer knew how to fly. She'd built everything by believing that winners rose to the top, that cream always separated from milk, that talent and intelligence and ruthless dedication were rewarded with power and recognition. Garrett Stone had possessed all of that and more, and he'd chosen to be invisible. 6 months later, Harper found herself back in Boston for a different reason. Her father had finally accepted that his heart couldn't sustain the pace he'd maintained for 40 years. The surgery was routine, or so the doctors said, but complications developed. He'd been transferred to a specialty cardiac unit, and Harper sat in another anonymous waiting room, reading magazines she didn't see. Her phone buzzed with urgent messages from her office. The Tokyo launch was facing regulatory hurdles. Her CFO needed approval on an acquisition. 3 different reporters wanted comments on a competitor's bankruptcy. She ignored them all and stared at the surgical board, watching names appear and disappear like arriving and departing flights. The surgery took 9 hours. When the cardiac surgeon finally emerged, she knew from his expression before he said a word. Successful repair. Full recovery expected. Her father would need to slow down, modify his lifestyle, accept that he was mortal after all. Harper thanked him and sat back down in the waiting room because she didn't know where else to go. Her mother had died when Harper was 12. She had no siblings. The company filled every corner of her life, leaving no room for the kind of relationships that showed up during hospital vigils. She was alone in the same way she'd always been alone, except now the weight of it felt different. Heavier, less like a badge of independence, and more like the consequence of choices she couldn't unmake. She left the hospital near midnight and drove without destination, finding herself on roads that led to the regional airport almost without conscious decision. The hangar was lit up despite the late hour, and Harper saw figures moving inside. She parked and walked across the tarmac, her heels clicking on concrete that still held the day's heat. Garrett was there, because of course he was, working on the engine of a small charter jet. Lucas was asleep on a cot in the office, visible through the window. Garrett looked up when Harper approached, surprise flickering across his face before settling back into neutral calm. "Ms. Caldwell, it's late." Harper had no explanation for why she'd come. "My father had surgery today. He's fine. But I was driving and ended up here." Garrett set down his tools and wiped his hands. "I'm glad he's okay." They stood in awkward silence. Finally, Harper spoke. "Can I ask you something? When you resigned your commission, when you walked away from flying, did you ever regret it?" Garrett looked at his sleeping son through the office window. Every single day. The honesty surprised her. He continued, "I regret not getting one more sortie, one more flight at the edge where everything is simple, because you're too busy staying alive to overthink it. I regret losing the brotherhood, the purpose, the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself." He turned back to face her. "But regret isn't the same as the wrong choice. I regret what I lost, but I chose what mattered more." Harper felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "How did you know? How did you know which choice was right?" Garrett's smile was sad and knowing. "I didn't. Not at first. I just knew that if I stayed, I'd lose Lucas the way my father lost me, too busy with important things to show up for the small moments that turned out to be the only things that mattered. By the time I figured that out, he was gone. Cancer, 2 years after I made lieutenant colonel. We'd barely spoken in a decade." Harper thought about her own father, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. His career finally forced to take second place to the body that had carried him through it. "I don't know how to be a different person than I am." The admission felt like defeat. Garrett shrugged. "You don't have to be different. You just have to decide what matters and build your life around that instead of the other way around. Might be the company, might be something else. But you can't have everything. Nobody can. That's the lie successful people tell themselves, that if they're smart enough, work hard enough, they can beat the basic math of being human. He returned to his work, giving her space to process. Harper watched him for a while, the methodical way he approached each task, the care he took with every connection and seal. This was what competence looked like, not corner offices and PowerPoint presentations, but hands that knew their work so thoroughly that excellence became automatic. She'd surrounded herself with impressive credentials and Ivy League degrees. But standing in this hangar, she wondered how many of her executives could actually do anything real. How many could fix what was broken rather than just strategize about it. Lucas stirred in the office and called out sleepily. Garrett immediately put down his tools and went to his son, lifting him with easy strength. The boy wrapped arms around his father's neck, still half asleep, and murmured something Harper couldn't hear. Garrett's response was quiet, just for Lucas, and watching them together, Harper felt the full weight of her own emptiness. $4 billion, 312 employees, 0 people who depended on her the way this child depended on his father. 0 people she'd built her life around instead of building them around her life. She said goodbye and left, drove back to her hotel, caught her morning flight to San Francisco where the Tokyo crisis awaited. But something had shifted in her, some calculus rebalanced. Over the following months, Harper began making changes. Small at first, leaving the office at 7 instead of 9, attending a niece's soccer game, calling her father weekly just to talk about nothing important. Her executives noticed, but said nothing. Her assistant quietly adjusted schedules. The company didn't collapse. Profits didn't crater. The world continued spinning despite Harper Caldwell's presence in it being slightly diminished. A year after the flight, Harper received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Lucas at a piano recital. Concentration fierce on his small face as his fingers found the keys. On the back, in handwriting, she recognized from the business card she'd left in that hangar, were 8 words. Teaching him what matters. Thank you for understanding. She put the photo in her office, replacing the magazine covers and framed awards. When people asked about it, she told them the truth. That's the son of the man who taught me the difference between value and price. Harper never saw Garrett Stone again. She stopped looking for him in airports, stopped wondering if fate would bring them together a second time. But she thought of him often, when making decisions about acquisitions, when interviewing candidates, when tempted to judge someone's worth by their resume instead of their character. The empire she'd built didn't crumble under the weight of her new perspective. If anything, it strengthened. Employees stayed longer. Innovation increased. The company culture shifted from cutthroat to something that still demanded excellence, but no longer required human sacrifice. Years later, when journalists asked Harper Caldwell about the turning point in her leadership philosophy, she told them about a flight that almost crashed and a mechanic who turned out to be the most capable person on board. She told them about learning the hard way that extraordinary people often chose ordinary lives because they understood something she'd spent 40 years missing. She told them about a photograph of a child at a piano recital and a father who'd traded medals for bedtime stories. And when they asked if she'd ever thanked him properly, she smiled and said yes, by trying to become someone who wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The final chapter came in an unexpected form. Harper's father lived another 7 years after his surgery, finally passing quietly in his sleep at 76. At the funeral, a stranger approached her, a woman in an Air Force dress uniform with captain's bars on her shoulders. "Ms. Caldwell, I served under your father's client back in the day. Actually, I served with Garrett Stone. He asked me to attend if I could." Harper's breath caught. "Is he?" The captain shook her head. "He's fine. Still in Boston. But he wanted you to know that your father's firm handled the legal work for his wife's estate. Pro bono. Your dad made sure Lucas's college fund was protected, made sure Garrett got every benefit he was entitled to as a veteran. Did it all quietly, never asked for credit. Harper stood in the cemetery, surrounded by people who'd known her father as the demanding attorney who never stopped working, and learned that he'd been carrying his own lessons about what mattered. The captain handed her an envelope. Garrett thought you should have this. Inside was a letter, brief and in Garrett's precise handwriting. Your father understood something I'm still learning, that doing good quietly is its own reward. He helped my family when we had nothing, and he never wanted recognition for it. I'm sorry for your loss. I hope you find peace knowing he made a difference in ways you're probably still discovering. And I hope you're teaching someone else what he taught me. That's how we keep the good ones alive. Harper folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She stood by her father's grave long after the other mourners had left, watching clouds move across an autumn sky that reminded her of that night on the runway when everything had changed. She'd spent so much of her life measuring success in numbers and accolades, in market share and magazine covers. Her father had spent his measuring success in hours billed and cases won. Both of them had missed what Garrett Stone understood instinctively, that the measure of a life wasn't what you achieved, but what you gave to those who needed it when no one was watching. The tech empire continued. The quarterly reports stayed strong, but Harper Caldwell, CEO and billionaire, began investing in a different kind of return. Scholarships for military families, funding for mechanics training programs, silent donations to causes that would never put her name on a building. And once a year, on the anniversary of the flight, she sent an anonymous gift to a piano teacher in Boston who gave lessons to a growing boy with his father's steady eyes and his mother's gift for music. She never included a note. She didn't need to. Some debts couldn't be repaid. They could only be passed forward. Lucas Stone graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to Juilliard. Garrett attended the ceremony in the same kind of simple clothes he'd worn on that flight, clean but unremarkable, a man who'd chosen to be defined by what he gave rather than what he'd achieved. In the audience, invisible among hundreds of other proud parents, sat a woman who'd learned the same lesson too late to undo her past, but early enough to change her future. When Lucas walked across the stage, both of them stood to applaud. Neither acknowledged the other. They didn't need to. They were connected by something deeper than gratitude, by the understanding that sometimes the people who save us do so by showing us we were looking for salvation in all the wrong places. The story of Harper Caldwell and Garrett Stone never made headlines again. The world moved on to newer dramas, fresher controversies. But in the quiet spaces where real life happens, their brief intersection continued to ripple outward in ways neither of them fully understood. Harper's company became known for valuing character over credentials. Garrett's son grew into a young man who understood that genius could wear grease-stained jackets and that sacrifice was just another word for love. And somewhere over the Atlantic, planes continued their nightly crossings, filled with passengers who'd never know how close they'd come to disaster or how many invisible heroes kept them safe while they slept. The final truth Harper learned was the simplest and hardest, that being saved doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it looks like humiliation. Sometimes it looks like having every assumption shattered and rebuilt from pieces you didn't know existed. Sometimes it looks like a man in a worn canvas jacket holding a sick child, walking past your mockery with steady eyes because he'd already done the hardest thing anyone can do. He'd figured out what mattered. And once you knew that, everything else, the medals and the glory and the applause, became just noise. Beautiful noise, maybe, but still, just noise. The music that mattered played in smaller rooms. for audiences of one.